Welcome to the latest instalment of Close Readings. In this series we're talking about individual poems. Poems we've selected because they are in some way or another political. They express political views, or they respond to political situations, or they strike up some interesting relationship with the politics of their day. My name is Seamus Perry and I teach English at Balliol College in Oxford, and I'm talking to Mark Ford, poet, critic and Professor of English at University College London. And today we have a political poem that very clearly responds to a contemporary political crisis, but does so in perhaps a rather unusual, perhaps even eccentric way. The Masque of Anarchy by Percy, Bysshe, Shelley, written in 1819, but not published until 1832, long after Shelley's premature death. And the event to which the poem is responding is something which very quickly became known as the Peterloo Massacre, which happened in Manchester in August 1819. And perhaps I should say just 2 minutes on that before we plunge into the poem itself. This was a large crowd. I think contemporary, that's to say modern historians think it was about 60,000 strong or so, who gathered to protest about unemployment and low wages, but particularly to support parliamentary reform and to extend the vote to all adult males. And it was one of several gatherings that had happened in England that summer. There had been earlier mass protests calling for this extension of the franchise in Birmingham and Leeds and in London. And there had been an attempt at a meeting in St. Peter's Field earlier in August 1819, which had been banned. But this one went ahead. However, warrants were immediately issued to arrest the principal speaker, who was a charismatic figure on the left called Henry, inverted commas, orator, inverted commas, Hunt. And so the police were sent in to the constables were sent in to arrest him. But they couldn't get through because the crowd was so packed. And this is when the disaster happened. The magistrates, who were keen to try and close the whole thing down, called on the yeomanry. And now the yeomanry was a corps of volunteers, and the rumours, at least that circulated afterwards, is that most of them had been seen drinking heavily in pubs all morning. The yeomanry sent in, they behaved ineffectively but also brutally, hacking around with their swords. And then something approaching civil order was only achieved when finally the hussars, that's to say the regular army, were sent in, and the hussars seem to have behaved on the whole in a much more humane way than the brutal yeomanry. So there's a kind of distinction between the amateur soldiers and the professional soldiers, and that's something that, oddly enough, Shelley picks up later in his poem. Anyway, at the end of this terrible day, 18 people were dead, and between 400 and 700 were injured, and a few days later Sidmouth, who's named in the poem Home Secretary, sends the Prince Regent's appreciation to the Manchester authorities for the very good job that they have done. So it's a pretty horrific political incident that Shelley is responding to.
Yes, and it was called Peterloo by sort of analogy with Waterloo, as a way of kind of stressing how kind of disastrous it was. It was a kind of crisis, and it was a period of extreme political repression as well, wasn't it? Kind of spies and agents provocateurs luring people into radical acts and then being charged and hanged for them and so on. And Shelley, interestingly, misses all this. He's in Italy. So this is a particularly sort of interesting, or in some ways quite anomalous poem in Shelley's corpus, in that every fibre of Shelley's poetry is political. That his whole concept of poetry is a way of dissolving the mind-forged manacles, to use Blake's term, which keep people subservient to the current political kind of status quo, the king, parliament, religion, that all these things Shelley sees as ghastly institutions which would need to be overthrown, and that his own mission and his own concept of poetry is as of somehow dissolving all these fixed belief systems, revealing them to be arbitrary and the result of kind of historical, an accident or power grabs or however you want to think of it, and somehow liberating people. So the idea of liberty, which becomes a key term later in the poem, was for radicals like Shelley and Byron utterly crucial, and it was a concept obviously deriving partly from the American Revolution, the ways in which in 1776 America had cut free, and of course the more contentious French Revolution of 1789. But so the reason that England was on such high alert was because of 1789 and the kind of bloodbath of the French Revolution. But Shelley's poetry often tries to approach political ideas in a rather abstract or oblique way. In the most famous example, Ozymandias, here is a tyrant, all that's left of him are his trunkless legs of stone in the desert, and by analogy, any tyranny can be overcome, will lapse with time. But this is a really a poetry that's absolutely wedded to its occasion. And yet it does start in that classic romantic way with a kind of dream vision. As I lay asleep in Italy, there came a voice from over the sea, and with great power it forth led me to walk in the visions of poesy.
Yes, so this is a very interesting poem, isn't it? A very interesting beginning for a poem which seeks to be engaged and actually seeks to have some kind of impact within the political life of England, although, as you say, Shelley hasn't lived in England since March the previous year. And it is absolutely in that tradition of romantic dream vision that you were describing. He's asleep. Is there, do you think, a note of self-reproach about the fact that he's at once distant, he's in Tuscany, he's not in Manchester, he's not fully awake, he's asleep, but nevertheless, even in this restricted form, he's going to find a way of addressing the major and the burning issues of the day?
It doesn't hold him back long if he does feel bad about it. And of course, his sense of poets was that they were the unacknowledged legislators of the world, and that their poems were kind of visions which would have a political effect on all readers. That the poet, as he saw the poet, was someone who, through his, and it is in his case his senses and his intuitive understanding of justice and the emotions, anticipates a utopian future and makes that utopian future somehow more likely to come to pass through poetry. So poetry is not in antithesis to politics ever in Shelley. Poetry and politics are kind of one and the same thing. We should say as well that he was really famous throughout the 19th century in particular as a kind of lyrical poet, a poet of kind of evanescent moods, of textures, of the wind, of music and so on. But he was political, and in this poem in particular he makes use of not the high romantic tradition of the kind of blank verse or of terza rima, which he often uses in Ode to the West Wind or Triumph of Life, but ballad form. So this poem is explicitly in a populist mode.
Yeah.
And in that sense, it connects with political pamphlets of the time, with political cartoons by such as Cruikshank and Gilray of the time. And it has a kind of lampoonish iconography and a kind of up and atom sort of kind of gusto in the way it approaches things. So nothing kind of lyrical or abstract, though there are moments of lyricism, as when he talks about the wind and the and so on. But in general, it's quite topical in most of its, certainly in its opening, its references.
Yeah, absolutely. Mary Shelley is on record saying that it had a more popular tone than usual for her husband's efforts. So it's not the abstractions of Mont Blanc or Ode to the West Wind. It's something which is deliberately meant to be an intervention, isn't it, in a particular historical moment. And Shelley sends it to his friend Leigh Hunt, not Orator Hunt, who spoke at Peterloo, but another Hunt, who runs a liberal periodical called The Examiner. And I suppose it's a sign that actually Shelley achieved something in the way of writing an interventionist kind of poem that Hunt, although he was a brave man in all sorts of ways, Hunt couldn't bring himself to publish it. He thought he'd just get into too much trouble.
Well, he'd already been in jail about sort of 7 or 8 years earlier for publishing attacks on the Prince Regent, and anyone who said anything about Peterloo ended up in jail, more or less. So, I mean, Hunt was quite right. If he had published it, he would have gone straight to jail. So, and it is a bit ironic that it comes out in 1832, the year of the Reform Act, and Hunt is able to say, well, even without the poem at the time, this has now been achieved, that suffrage has been expanded. But as was in some ways rather a tragic feature of Shelley's career, almost none of his kind of most kind of radical poetry did get published in his life, and it didn't really affect the way he was read in the 19th century that much. It's only in the 20th century that this sense of read Shelley, to use the name the title of Paul Foot's book on him from 1980, that Shelley comes over as this kind of absolutely kind of radically charged poet whose every fibre of his being is determined to overthrow the powers that be and institute a kind of utopian free love, not exactly anarchist vision, certainly one in tune with the kind of 60s hippie utopian communes. But of course, the great evil in this poem is anarchy, that we meet three characters, and it's a rather allegorical poem as well, isn't it?
It begins that way, doesn't it? Yes, that's right. Maybe we should say something about that. So the Masque of Anarchy is the name of the poem, but the Masque of Anarchy is also something that happens inside the poem, isn't it? And by masque, what Shelley is invoking is the idea of masque, M-A-S-Q-U-E, a sort of Italian Renaissance kind of dramatic performance where if you went to a grand house or you were visiting or a grand person was visiting your house, you might put on a small allegorical drama about typically the virtues like mercy or justice or something like that. Well, what happens at the opening of Shelley's poem is a kind of hideous perversion of that masque tradition, is it? So we meet a series of abstractions with capital letters: murder, fraud, and hypocrisy. And they are all these figures, they are all momentarily embodied in members of the British cabinet. I met Murder on the way. He had a mask like Castlereagh. Next came Fraud, and Castlereagh's the Foreign Secretary, very, very big and important presence within the cabinet. Next came Fraud, and he had on, like Eldon, an ermined gown. Eldon was the Lord Chancellor. He was also the judge who had deprived Shelley of the custody of his children. So there was a personal animosity towards Eldon. And then Sidmouth next, Hypocrisy, on a crocodile rode by. And Sidmouth is the Home Secretary, so ultimately in charge of the policing of events like the St. Peter's Field gathering. So this is an interesting way into the politics, isn't it? He doesn't say Castlereagh, Eldon, Sidmouth, you are all hateful shits. He says murder, fraud, and hypocrisy are bad things, and they are momentarily being embodied in these people.
Yes, and it's worth saying that the masque was a kind of aristocratic and hierarchical kind of performance, which cemented the power structures of the day. So this is a kind of anti-masque, and it's also showing the ways in which, as is the case with so much of Shelley's poetry, that all the institutions which guaranteed power, which seem like they're founded on something utterly kind of determined or real or organic, are actually arbitrary constructions or fictions of power.
Yes, they're frauds.
Fraudulent hoodwinkings of the people. And if only we would awake from our slumber, we would cast off our chains. And in this poem, he makes the very kind of rather sort of daring the iconography is rather daring, that chains are seen as like dew. So chains which seem like you can never escape your chains, in fact, they're like dew. So again, to use the Blake term, mind-forged manacles, that these chains, if we could just get our heads around the fact that they're all fictions, we could overthrow them and achieve some kind of utopian liberation.
Absolutely. It's like an extraordinarily premature and poetic attempt to get to the idea of ideology in modern Marxist theory, isn't it? That the really successful regime actually establishes false consciousness in its people, so that they support things which are actually against their interests.
And the whole first part of the poem, which presents the masque of murder, fraud, hypocrisy, and then anarchy, which is seen on his white horse. I mean, it's kind of the iconography of the poem is very, very sort of drawn from all sorts of eclectic sources. This comes from Benjamin West's picture of death on the pale horse.
Yes.
This white horse with anarchy on top of it, with blood splash.
And there's a lot of revelations in it too, isn't there?
Yes, and he's wearing a crown as he is in the West picture. And anarchy seems to sum up for Shelley everything. It's a kind of compendium term for everything which is rapacious and ruthless and remorseless and greedy and squashes the people and deprives them of a living or of family bonds. It's all that is bad. And anarchy, in this first section, anarchy is adored by everyone, because it has this mantra: "I am God and King and law." The three institutions which Shelley hated: God, institutional religion. He was an atheist. He was expelled from University College London, University College Oxford, wasn't he, for a pamphlet on atheism?
That's right. The necessity of atheism. That's right. And I think Eldon had a hand in that too, I think.
Okay, so he had a real grudge there. King, obviously, he hated. I mean, there's a terrific poem, 1819, when he talks about an old, mad, blind, despised and dying king.
That's right.
George III. I mean, and he hated the Prince Regent even more, if possible, I think. Well,
if possible. Yes, that's right.
Everyone did.
That's right. If you enjoyed this episode, please do try signing up to the Close Reading subscription, where you'll find our full 12-part series on 19th and 20th century long poems and short stories, The Long and Short. You can sign up directly in Apple Podcasts or in other podcast apps. Just follow the links in the description.